I'm Simon Taylor. I'm a Senior Advisor at Rude Pedersen. And we have with us today Jos Delbeke. Jos is a professor at the moment, a professor of transnational governance at the European University Institute in Florence, former Director-General in DG Climate Action, DG CLIMA. Joining him for the discussion, we have Peter Vis. Peter is also a senior advisor here at Rude Pedersen, but Peter was the chef de cabinet to the EU's first climate action commissioner, Connie Hedegaard, and also served in the cabinet of Andris Piebalgs. And we also have my colleague, Joanna Lepmetz, who is going to be helping us with the questions and also with the polls that the online polls that we're going to be running as part of the debate today. Just, it's obviously the second event. We did one on Tuesday with Diederik Samson, the head of the cabinet of Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. It went very well. We had a very strong participation, and we're hoping to build on that success today. We have future events and speakers lined up. Next week on Tuesday, March the 31st, we'll be talking to Kai Luca, head of external policy at ZF. ZF is a very important technology company from Germany that supplies parts for the automotive sector. Started out making gearboxes, now has a broad range of technologies. And Barry Linham, now Energy Solutions, will be joining us soon as well. The format will be me asking questions to Jos and Peter and getting them to comment and hopefully disagree. We want this to be an interactive session. We want you to play as full a part in the debate as possible. So you are able to send comments to Joanna via the chat box on the right. If you haven't got that menu open, just click on the red tab with 3 dots and you'll see you get a range of options, including chats. We will frequently take up your questions and put them to our speakers, so please take advantage of that. We're also going to be running a series of polls today. So maybe, Joanna, you could launch the first one, maybe just so that people can see. The first poll is about the intervention in the carbon markets. And should there be an intervention from regulators if the carbon price falls below, we've said €10 a ton of CO2 equivalent, because obviously that's historically very low level. But we'll come back to that in the course of the debate. One other important thing to mention is that Jos and Peter are editors of a very useful guide to the future of the ETS. And if you look at Jos's on-screen image just behind his ear, you will see the cover of the book. Yeah. We're also making this book available to you for free as a PDF download. And how do you get it? Then you click on the Offers tab, which doesn't seem to be live right at the moment, but we will make it live, and then you can, I think, directly download your copy from there. Peter did say it's also available for sale on Amazon, so if you want, if you prefer a hard copy, that's available as well. Great, I think that's all the housekeeping. So let's get on with the meat of today's event. Obviously, the issue that's concerning everyone is the effect of the coronavirus. Maybe let's just set that aside for now, because I think how it affects industry and the economy in general will come back as we discuss aspects of the ETS and indeed other policy instruments that can complement the ETS or maybe even replace it in some areas. So let's start off with a question to you, Jos, about the 2030 target. Now, when you were working in DG CLIMA, you were instrumental in the agreement to set the target for 2030 at 40%. For now, there seems to be, if not a consensus, there's rarely a consensus on climate matters, but certainly a strong majority in favour of going to 55%. What do you think about the case for substantially increasing the target for 2030?
Well, I think there is a good case for doing that. Let's remind ourselves, when we did the work on the 40% for 2030, we were in the middle of the banking crisis and the euro crisis. So it was very hard work to have that figure agreed before the Paris Agreement. But now we have the Paris Agreement, and climate neutrality has been enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So we are, to some extent, in a different world. And I'm a strong believer that we should upgrade our targets. Let's wait for the impact assessment of the Commission, whether we go for 50% or 55%. We will have, of course, the Corona crisis and the fallout of that. There's going to be a stimulus package. Let's see and make sure that no measure of the stimulus package goes against the Green Deal. And there may even opportunity as part of the stimulus package to reprioritize inside the Green Deal long list of measures that we are planning to do, to bring forward some that were planned for later. And let's look for a synergy between the Corona crisis, the stimulus package, and what we need to do in the Green Deal. Only one element, pricing carbon makes a lot of sense. If we do it properly, pricing carbon generates a lot of revenue. Now, this public revenue will be in big need because any stimulus package, once we come out of this deep crisis, will require funding. And so carbon pricing may be a very astute way of putting taxes there or revenues to be raised by pricing carbon there, where pollution is being discouraged as a structural long-term measure. So all in all, fine to go higher. Times have changed. We have the Paris Agreement behind us, but let's incorporate the stimulus package that we are going to see of the following the Corona crisis. But let's look for synergies to immediately kickstart meaningful measures under the Green Deal as well as under the Corona crisis package.
Okay, so Peter, I mean, in this, you've lived through these debates before. In the discussion on setting targets, the energy-intensive industries always riposte that the target's too high or the target is too ambitious. They're going to have really very powerful arguments for not being too ambitious because of the devastating economic impact of the coronavirus. How do you politically, how do you see dealing with those, that pushback?
Right, Simon, the sound wasn't so good during some of your question, but I think I understood what you were asking. What can the energy intensive industry expect now? I mean, it's clearly going to be in great difficulty. A lot of industry sectors are going to have difficulty due to the economic slowdown that's happening. And that those difficulties are real and they're very immediate. However, there will also be, as Jos has mentioned, there will be a number of governmental measures taken, even international measures, such as the European Union might take, to re-stimulate the economy. And in that sense, the use of whatever funds are made available, how they're used is crucial, and the do no harm principle seems, of course, a very good one with regards to the climate objective, which remains absolutely important to address. The climate crisis is a much longer term crisis. The immediate one that we must focus on is the corona crisis, and we must obviously address the health requirements and the capabilities in the very, very short term. But in getting out of the crisis, as we mustn't create further obstacles towards the addressing climate change. And I think we can do both at the same time if the stimulus measures are carefully chosen so as to be compatible with and even reinforce the Green Deal's initiative. But from an industry perspective, to some extent, the measure that impacts on industry most within the European Union is the emissions trading scheme, which we're talking about today. and the carbon price has dropped very considerably in the recent weeks because of the economic slowdown. And that kind of adjustment of the mechanism in real time is one way that the pressure on industry is taken off in these circumstances. At least, you know, that if the carbon price was still 25 as it was a month ago, in fact it's nearer 15, that's the sort of adjustment we would expect there to be when the economy slows, as is happening now. And it's a sort of automatic stabilizer within the emissions trading scheme. But the good news is that the emissions trading scheme is continuing to function in delivering the reductions that it's been programmed to deliver. So no one should worry unduly about the price, because the reductions that are programmed into the emissions trading scheme are going to be made.
If I may come in, this anti-cyclical element of the ETS, I think, is a very strong one. And it has been subject of terrible discussions when the carbon price was low following the banking crisis and the euro crisis. And I'm far from saying that it was a good thing that prices went as deep as they were. Today we have the market stability reserve. We are not going to see that repeated. But what is important is that if we look at the period since the start in 2005 and today, the covered companies have reduced their emissions with almost a third. And that is nowhere else to be found in the economy, because we are arguing about more or less 45% of the emissions of the EU that are coming from the companies in the energy and the industrial sector. Now, they collectively reduced their emissions with more than 30% since 2005. That is a big achievement. That is what matters more than the price.
Should we bring in the results of the first poll at this point, because they're quite interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the results so far are that 70% of our audience is in favor, and 29% says no.
And so the question there was, you know, should regulators intervene again? So there seems to be a view that actually more further changes are necessary to the system. So there seems to be, at least from our audience, a view that we didn't ask about a floor price, but there seems to be, you know, concern that the carbon price can drop too low and support for reopening it.
But if I may come in on that, I would think that we are not going to go as low as the 10 euros that is mentioned here, because we have a novelty in the system, that is the market stability reserve that starts functioning as of next year. And it has been functioning already very significantly, because as soon as we decided on that market stability reserve, prices jumped up from 5-7 euros to the 25-30 euros that we have been seeing until a week or 10 days ago. So I would say the market stability reserve is going to be a stabilizer, but I'm not hiding the fact that we just made the argument for the anti-cyclical nature of the instrument. Fluctuations are normal for a market-based instrument, and we may see fluctuations between 10 and 25 euros in the weeks to come, where we will see more upheaval on the economic front. But I have strong confidence that the market stability reserve, as it is designed now, is going to do the trick.
Can I also say, Simon, that the Green Deal quite clearly announces that the emissions trading system as a whole is being reviewed now, and it's likely to lead to an amendment next year. Now, let's be honest, any intervention in the market now of the sort to change the parameters of the market stability reserve would require legislation that would have to be decided by the ordinary legislative procedure, which, as we know, takes a long time. So we're heading towards a new amendment to the ETS. And indeed, if it reflects a higher level of ambition, towards 55% conceivably, some degree of increased stringency will have to be incorporated within the emissions trading scheme. And that knowledge alone ought to prevent the price from falling too far, because in a way, companies who can afford it and are farsighted might choose to buy when the price is low, knowing that scarcity will
Sure.
lie more
Sure.
acute in the future.
Yeah. So that's exactly. I wanted to come on to changes to the ETS and the scope and the sectors that are included. And we have a second poll on this. So if you could look again at your polls, we've launched a second one asking the question about which sectors should be added to the ETS. So we have transport, buildings, both, and neither. So you've got quite a range to think of there. Maybe Jos. So what we'll do is we'll let that poll run while Jos and Peter are discussing this. Jos, what are your views on are there which sectors do you favour or will have the greatest impact by being added to the ETF?
Well, economists have a strong argument that the price signal on carbon should be the same across the economy. So the more sectors are covered, the better the system is functioning. So that's a very good thing, to have a design on which we will widen the scope of the ETS to include as well transport and construction buildings. But there is a reason why we did not do that at the beginning. And we did not do that because an ETS only functions well if the MRV, the monitoring, reporting and verification, is absolutely excellent. Now, we are entering into new territory, and so we should prepare for that change over time, but we should not rush ahead, because if we have the MRV wrong, we risk destabilizing the ETS as it is functioning, and as we said, functioning efficiently today. So in that respect, I'm following with a lot of interest what is happening in Germany, because they went through a debate as well, whether they would have in parallel an emissions trading system on transport and households and buildings, and how over time that could be merged with the existing ETS as we know it. So having that step or making that change in 2 steps, I think makes a lot of sense. And we will see how the system now unfolds in Germany. It may be a very useful experiment before we widen it up at the European level. Having said that, I think we should steam ahead with the price signal for carbon, for the transport and the building sector. So we should not wait until we have all the details right. And the vehicle to do that could be the review of the Energy Tax Directive, because the Energy Tax Directive could be conceived according to 2 channels. On the one hand, taxing energy, that it means the joule that is incorporated in a product or a service. And on top of that, a carbon element that is reflecting the carbon content of the energy product or service that is being delivered. And if the Energy Tax Directive would do that as an immediate step, we could perhaps be helpful to the stimulus package that Corona is going to require in bringing on board a number of incentives that over time lead the economy towards a solid structure, an efficient structure for bringing down carbon across the board.
Peter, I mean, my understanding was that the ETS was there because it was very difficult politically to get the member states to agree on taxation, because
You're absolutely right. And I was going to make that point that taxes may be very efficient. They're relatively simple to put in place. We're used to them, let's face it. But any changes of the sort that we're talking about, to put taxes up on transport and buildings, is going to require the unanimous agreement of all the 27 member states. And in the past, this has proven very, very difficult to get. So that would be my first preference. But if we can't get it on taxation, then of course, putting it into the emissions trading scheme would be a way that we should look at very carefully. And I think it could be done. But at the end of the day, for me, the taxation instrument is a simpler instrument. And I don't, you know, that there are, if you like, good reasons not to be changing the ETS, the emissions trading system, so much or very much, because let's be honest, it's only really started working properly in the last 2 or 3 years since its most recent amendment. So now it's doing a bit what it was supposed to do from the start. And I think we've got to be careful of destabilizing an instrument like that.
The unanimity requirement is, of course, a very important one, and I'm fully aware of that. But there is also a provision about enhanced cooperation. So perhaps if we have exhausted the possibilities of unanimity requirement, we could go for a kind of qualified majority element also in the field of taxation. Or we could also have some 10, 12 member states already starting to do it in expectation that a unanimity requirement may be realized over a somewhat longer period, but nevertheless getting started immediately. So there are ways to overcome it, but it is, according to the treaty, a major impediment indeed that taxation has to be decided with unanimity.
Okay, I want to come back to adding individual sectors in a minute, but Joanna's flagging up to me that we have a question on the functioning of how the ETS is working. Joanna.
Yes, indeed, and I see everybody's questions coming in, but I would encourage you to be even more active at this stage. So the question is coming in on the distorting of the internal market, and so the ETS sets an EU-wide carbon price, but only richer member states can compensate the industry electricity costs. So seeing that the Green Deal is focusing on just and fair transition, how should the EU mitigate against these distribution effects?
I think that's a very important question, because what we see, and that is a very perverse effect, is that member states are compensating the indirect costs, as they call it, following from the ETS. That means that the ETS normally leads to a somewhat higher electricity price. And these higher electricity prices are then compensated by national governments. Now, that's not the design of the instrument. Worse, the revenues of the ETS are being spoiled, so to speak, in compensating the effect that the ETS was meant to achieve. So I think, and I would hope, that the next review of the ETS that is planned for 2021, market stability reserve, etc., may be widened up to more questions, is going to address that issue. The indirect cost compensation runs against the internal market, runs against the efficiency of the instrument, and needs to be sorted out. So far, we have been doing that under the state aid guidelines for energy, for energy and environment. But obviously, the practice has not disappeared and is not an efficient way of using public revenue. So the indirect cost compensation should be squarely on the table for the next review of the ETS. Yes. I would strongly agree to that.
But do you think politically it will run into opposition? The member states that can afford to do it will...
I think that's obvious. I mean, the reason that only 10 member states want to do it or choose to do it is important, because it implies that the other 17 are not either able nor choose to do it. So I think the answer to any risk of there being distortion as a result of this is that there could be agreement either to everyone to do it or nobody to do it. Harmonization, in other words, is indeed the sort of way of avoiding distortion. But having said that, I would say this: these 10 member states that choose to do it, they do have to go through what we call state aid scrutiny. The competition authorities look at that there should not be any distortion to the internal market. So I don't really think there is as much distortion as is claimed. Having said that, for some sectors of industry, this compensation that's paid to them for higher electricity costs is essential. And we've got to be conscious of that, because we don't want those sectors to leave the EU, start producing elsewhere in the world. We want to keep them in Europe with all the jobs that they create. Thanks.
Okay.
I would agree. If we cannot remove the corrections that are being sought after in this indirect cost compensation, if we would have equal treatment for everybody in the internal market and have harmonized criteria, that would already be a big step forward, because now it's a bit of a hidden subsidy that is à la tête du client. And we see that member states are competing with one another, underrating the distortions that they are creating to the competition on the electricity market. So fully in agreement. The more we can have a harmonized solution, if we cannot get away from the indirect cost compensation entirely, the better.
Okay, I want to just take us back to adding sectors. I think we can maybe come back to what we've just been talking about if we talk about carbon border adjustment mechanism. Joanna, could you just give us the results of the second poll, which was about which sectors should be added to the ETS?
So the most popular option was that both sectors should be added, 35%. At 33, there is transport. At 19, there is neither, and buildings is the least at 11. So the most popular was both.
Great, thanks, Joanna. Jos, you mentioned kerosene, I think, kerosene tax. The big sector where that seems to still have favourable treatment is the aviation sector. And it's obviously an industry that has grown very fast. Cheap flights, low-cost travel has been in many ways a European success story, but the emissions from this sector have grown very fast. And do you think adding aviation to the ETS is the best way to address this issue?
Absolutely. We did that. In fact, it's foreseen by the directive that we were putting the entire exercise on hold because of the opposition that we were encountering worldwide.
Yeah.
Now, worldwide, in the context of ICAO, a kind of second best solution has been designed, which is named CORSIA. It's an offset instrument. But when I see and look at the details of CORSIA, I question whether that instrument is going to have a major impact. It's badly designed. It is the governance surrounding that CORSIA instrument are going to be very weak. I would reverse gear, and I would say if we cannot put international flights under the ETS, then we should go for a taxation on kerosene. We can now ask ourselves why we have tax-free kerosene, while you and me are paying a high tax when we fill up our tank of our car and pay for the diesel and the benzene we would like to fill up for. So I think, and I do realize, of course, that now with the Corona crisis, the aviation sector is extremely hit.
Yeah,
I think we should reflect at the European level on a European pact with aviation, where in the short term we say, yes, we cannot send all these people working in the aviation sector simply home. There is an urgency that needs to be tackled, and we need also a solid aviation industry. So there is nothing wrong with aviation. But at the same time, the second pillar is that we should remove over time, gradually, all tax breaks that have been granted to the aviation sector. And that goes very far. Even VAT on tickets is not charged, let alone taxation on kerosene. And so I think it's the moment now when the aviation sector is asking for big support and already has been quoting precise numbers, that we make a pact and say, okay, to some extent, your immediate needs are going to be heard, but at the same time, over a period of 2-3 years, we have to repair the system and remove all exemptions on taxation. And I think on kerosene, my first option would be to have a tax on kerosene, like we have a tax on motor fuels. If, as a second option, we would bring back the international aviation under the ETS, that may be a solution as well. But there is one thing I would like to mention, that when we tried to bring the international aviation under the ETS, Europe was criticized of not respecting the extraterritoriality principle.
Yeah.
And we went as far as the European Court of Justice. And I think that lawyers have been deciding, European Court of Justice, that it is not extraterritorial. And if we look at the treaty that founded the ICAO, that I think it's the Treaty of Chicago, if we look at this and look at the detail, there is no impediment of doing that. We just have to have the guts in the EU to say, look, guys, as of now, for any kerosene that is being tanked on the territory of the EU, we are now going to have a tax on added that is similar to what we do on motor fuels. I think the time has come. We are now 50, 70 years after the Chicago Treaty. It's time to rethink things.
Yeah. Peter, what do you think about the politics of it? I mean, Jos highlights...
I would see another way forward, if I may express that. I'm fearful that if you, on the one hand, first, this industry sector has been crushed by the present circumstances. Nobody's flying. Whole airlines have grounded all their aircraft. And there is, of course, a discussion about whether government money can be directed towards them. And of course, government money usually comes with strings attached. And that is, I think, very much to be expected. Whether or not government should give money on the one hand and then impose taxes on the sector on the other, it's a little bit, to me, they conflict with each other. I would take another route forward. First of all, I would say the aviation sector would like to be clean and sustainable if it could be. And so we've got to think of ways that will help them become sustainable. And I think we've got to think of an idea such as aviation being required to buy a certain percentage of fuel that is produced synthetically without carbon emissions, synthetic fuels. There are such things. There's not much availability at the moment, so the percentages would be very small. And of course, it's very expensive. So the aviation industry generally would hesitate to want to pay more for fuel. But the truth is, this is a way whereby the industry can eventually, as the share of emissions-free fuel increases, the industry can aspire to becoming sustainable. And that, for me, is to address the problem from a slightly different perspective, but it's a way whereby we might help this sector become sustainable as opposed to just tax the use of its fuel and the tickets that are sold and so on. I mean, it's a debate to be had, which is the most effective, but I think we've got to also be mindful of all the benefits that aviation does provide, not just in Europe, but also to developing countries where their economies require connectivity, and certain parts of Europe do as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I want to come back in a moment to the buildings sector, because that was one of the other questions we asked in the poll. But we're getting some questions online about the maritime sector. Joanna, could you share some of those with us? On shipping.
Right. There's a question. Forgive me, coming in from Erika Merlink, which is it possible to have an update on the possibility to introduce MRV shipping within the EU ETS?
I mean, in view of the fact that the discussion on maritime is behind the aviation sector, so...
Yeah. Well, it is behind because there have not been any formulation of policy proposals, because we wanted to know first. So the MRV that is being mentioned in the question is a pillar, because without knowing what is happening, without knowing the technology of the ships, you cannot do anything. And so that's a big step forward, but we have now to make the next step. And that is that on the basis of this MRV, we have to study how to include, we have to decide how to include precisely the maritime sector in the ETS. I think it's high time. The sector has had plenty of time, just as the aviation sector, more than a decade to prepare itself. Now, Europe should leverage the situation in such a manner that it is going to include it into the ETS according to modalities that are incorporating the particularities of the navigation sector, which is that a lot of fuel can be carried all over the world because it's a volume in terms of having space ownership is not a problem, contrary to the aviation sector. But experts have come around to that and should make a proposal to include the navigation activities, the maritime activities into the ETS sooner rather than later.
Okay, Peter, do you have anything to add, or
Look,
otherwise we'll...
I think it might be doable to put the maritime in the ETS because we already monitor emissions, but there will be pushback from third countries who have to transport their goods from a long way. And so I would say that if we go down that road, we must ensure that the revenues from that are generated by inclusion into the emissions trading scheme are recycled and help the industry decarbonize. What I really want to do is to ensure in every sector that regulation enables the sustainable development of that sector, as opposed to just, you know, takes money away from. And so that is, if you like, the precondition. There must be some sort of revenue recycling for the good purpose of investment and innovation.
So that sounds like a good opportunity for me to double back and bring up the question of including buildings. You saw from our online poll that there was much less support for adding buildings. And I think we have a question specifically on buildings, don't we, Joanna?
Indeed. So if the question goes, if you include buildings in the EU ETS, you will put up people's housing costs. Would that be counterproductive if you want to drive renovation? And could you run into opposition as so many people in the society would be affected by that?
I mean, first of all, how would you bring buildings into the ETS anyway? I mean, it's not a sector that fits very easily.
Simon,
well, I think the essence is to bring in the fossil fuels that are being consumed in a building. So that's heating oil and gas, basically. And that's where I would have first a very pragmatic look. In some countries, gas is treated differently compared to electricity or heating oil, or in the reverse. So having a rational criteria of taxing fossil fuels exactly the same manner, or according to the same criteria, according to carbon content, for example. I question why VAT rates are sometimes lower for gas compared to what is charged on electricity. That's counterproductive. So before we go into the big question about how to include the heating fuels into the ETS, because that would be the way to do that, let's look at the practicalities of how it is being done when it comes to excise duties and VAT. I think in that sense, the energy tax directive that we have been mentioning partially has a major task in front of it. That is that the review of the energy tax directive must remove a lot of inconsistencies that are there. And there are many. And there are many and very different according to different member states. So let's get a bit of order in a big cheese with lots of holes and big holes in it. So let's start there. And it applies in particular to the building sector.
Yeah, Peter, you wanted to come in?
I'll tell you that I didn't answer the poll, but if I had done, I would have suggested that we don't bring buildings into the emissions trading system. I would prefer, and I think more effective, are the building standards, renovation standards and such as we use, because I think that just putting up the price of fuels, whether that be through the emissions trading or through an energy tax, can impact people adversely, poorer households, who often rent as opposed to own the house, so they're not going to be the ones who can afford nor should buy a new boiler and switch the fuel of that boiler, etc. So for me, standards are, if you like, tend to be the instrument we use. But look, let's come back to this when we talk for a whole session about buildings at a later stage of our series of talks. But for now, I would say the buildings in the ETS doesn't sound to me like something I would do as a first preference or a second preference.
Okay,
but we would agree that the incentives to the consumer should be rational. And now the incentive structure is on many occasions irrational, and that is not creating, for example, an incentive to put heating or heat pumps into your house instead of continuing with the classic heating instruments based on oil and gas.
Yeah. Joanna, should we just have a look at the results of the poll about increasing energy taxes?
Indeed. So the question was if the energy taxes should be increased to drive greenhouse gas emission reductions. And the most popular response by 52% of the respondees is that only on those products that directly emit CO2. 37% says yes, and 7% says no.
It's striking, isn't it, how few people say no? I mean, that is what I take away from this.
Yeah.
And also so how different electricity is compared to heating fuels like gas and oil.
Just a final comment on buildings for a second. What do you think the best way to drive renovation is, if taxation is a blunt instrument and maybe a divisive instrument? Jos?
Well, if you have taxation, you can also invent tax reductions or exemptions, and that ties in to the whole question that we have not yet been addressing, is that ETS is one instrument alongside many other instruments.
Yeah.
So it is not excluding the need for regulations, building in the building sector, and et cetera, the way we are having them. So we just have to make sure they are working in synergy with one another. There is also the question about innovation. That's a frequently heard question. Is the ETS favoring innovation? Of course it does, but that does not preempt the need for an innovation policy. And I think the two have to work hand in hand together. But the main objective of the ETS is to capture low-cost emission reduction. And innovation mostly is at the higher cost level. And so that's why the two have to be tuned in to one another. What is very important, and that is where the ETS is encouraging innovation, is with a solid long-term perspective. The Green Deal has said, and our leaders have said, climate neutrality by 2050 is the long-term objective. Without lots of innovations, we are not going to make it. And that drives ultimately, via a carbon price, innovations into the market, and maybe a lot more helped by solid innovation policies. And I would hope that some of the stimulus package that we may see coming along to fight the corona crisis is also going to take up that opportunity of having innovation policy, speedy it up, also in line with the long-term challenge we have on the climate change and on the green issues.
Okay. We're getting quite a lot of questions about, quite technical questions about the ETS, which I think it would be a shame if we didn't profit from your presence to try and get answers to some of them. Joanna, do you want to give us a few of them? There's some on mitigation, I notice. Do you want to? There's one on carbon leakage.
Yes. Okay.
That's a good one.
Yes. Well, so far, we.
Can we hear the question? Jos, can we hear the question from Joanna?
Okay. First, yes. Okay, fine. Sorry. And I don't
you don't get to choose your own question, Jos.
I don't know the answer to what Joanna is going to say now.
Okay, Joanna.
We can't hear you.
You're muted. You're muted, Joanna.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. So the questions are often preceded by comments because that's how people like it. So carbon leakage measures are needed as a result of higher 2030 targets. With a higher greenhouse gas target for 2030, industry will need stronger carbon leakage protection. Considering that carbon border adjustment mechanism won't work for many sectors, what other alternative of carbon leakage protection mechanisms are there to protect these industries.
Okay, and Jos, before you answer, we have a final poll on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So let's, Johan, if you can launch that, and then we can see what the online audience says. We'll come back to that later in the discussion. But if you want to address the carbon leakage question for now, Jos.
Yes, well, what we tried to do so far is to have a system of free allocation that is fairly generous. In fact, 43% of the allowances that are being traded are given out for free to industry. And the criterion is a technological benchmark. And I think we have to look again at those benchmarks because they are based on what was the technological reality of 2005, 2008. Today, things have changed dramatically, and we have made a huge leap forward in terms of low carbon technologies. So revisiting those benchmarks, in my view, is the first task that needs to be done. The Commission services are working on that, if I understand, with a lot of good cooperation of industries. But I would say, let's first have a look at the better system of free allocation. And coupled to that, let's look at our innovation tools. We have an innovation fund, we have the Horizon 2020. We can make that, going very much in synergy together. So that's another major pillar of how we could fight the distortions of competition that are perceived. I would wait and see on whether we are going to see much higher carbon price levels once we go for the higher targets. And why am I saying that? First, we see that coal is removed quicker out of the energy system as foreseen. And second, the drive to renewable energy is going much quicker compared to what we have seen so far, because the cost reductions in this sector are just continued to be spectacular. So perhaps there is a bit of margin inside the ETS, so that we see in the energy sector that emissions go down quicker as foreseen, which gives and creates a little bit of breathing space for the industrials. So it remains to be seen on whether we will see a radical price hike that many people seem to assume if we go, say, for the 50% target that has been advanced as one of the possibilities alongst the 55% side.
It's logical that as we are more and more ambitious with our climate targets, then the pressure that is the regulatory pressure we put on our businesses is increased. But of course, that logic has still to be demonstrated. I mean, basically, as we see now, the price of carbon is falling as opposed to rising as we might have expected. That's due to the particular circumstances of today, and we don't know for how long prices will stay low. I would say that I'm really very doubtful about the idea of a border tax adjustment. I know there's a poll going on right now, but I really think it's not a good idea. And I'll tell you one reason. Yesterday I explained that it was because the Paris Agreement architecture explicitly allows countries to make their own pledges. And in a way, we're then putting ourselves in a position of judgment over whether the other countries are doing enough. I think diplomatically, that's going to be very difficult to win every widespread support for the idea internationally. And if we undermine the Paris Agreement, or if we're deemed to be or seen to be doing something that's unhelpful, I don't think that's what we want. But the further reason is that the Paris Agreement calculates emissions that are emitted on the territory of a country. The Paris Agreement, if you like, doesn't calculate the flows of carbon from one country to another. Mm-hmm. And so basically, if we are doing that for the purposes of our border tax adjustment, saying this imported product has got carbon in it due to its production that we wish to levy some charge upon, we are then using a different matrix of measurement to the international process. And I think we're going to go down a road. I mean, either the international process changes to use a method based on consumption rather than production, and then everybody makes the change together, or we stick with what we've got. But for the Europe to try to use both measurement matrices, I think that's going to lead for a lot of conflict, a lot of complexity, and a lot of misunderstanding by other countries who said, hang on, you agreed we could do what we think we could do, and now you're saying it's not enough and you're measuring our emissions too. It seems to me we've got to be very careful, and the WTO is definitely the place to do much, much more talking in, because we'd have to stay online with them.
You want to just come in? Can I, if you want to make a brief comment, and then I'm going to ask Joanna to share the results of the poll with us, and then we'll move on from this issue, because there are quite a lot of questions backed up I'd like to fire at you, gentlemen. So Jos, you wanted to come in on border?
Yes, I wanted to add a comment, and that is that Europe is not alone with its ETS. As we speak, the Chinese are introducing a nationwide Chinese ETS. And if we think a moment further, I would not exclude, because the ETS idea comes from the United States, that also the United States, if they would elect another president, that they are looking for more cooperation in the field of climate change, and perhaps that they go for a kind of carbon trading like we are having in Europe. So I think the picture is not as bleak as it is when we project ourselves over the next 3 to 5 years. Because major players, and China and the United States are major players in this context, are doing and may be doing what they are doing. The Chinese are much more advanced compared to the United States. But when I hear what Joe Biden has been saying with a little pressure of Mr. Sanders, you know, it is going in the right direction. So, but let's not speculate on that. Yep. There are other constituencies, Canada, California, New Zealand, you know, Korea, they are going into ETS. So let's, before we jump to the gun, let's see how far we come.
Okay, great. You want to just share the results of the poll with us, if you would?
So the question was if people are in favor of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the most popular answer, 55%, is yes, but only if compatible with WTO rules. 30% is yes in all circumstances, and 15% say no.
Okay, I'm in a bit of a minority there, I can see. But,
okay, we've got 7 minutes left, and we have some questions outstanding. So I think there was some about innovation, Joanna, that I think we're worth exploring.
Yes. So a question that goes that ETS has failed to develop investment and breakthrough technologies. What are the reasons for this? And is the ETS the right tool for innovation?
If I may come into that, I think the ETS was never meant, was never designed to support breakthrough technologies, because breakthrough technologies are, per definition, in the first phase, expensive technologies. The strength of the carbon market is to suck out of the economic system the low-cost options. So that's the strength of the system. But breakthrough technologies will have to be brought forward through innovation policy instruments. Some of the revenues of the ETS are set aside in the Innovation Fund. So that is where we have to look for support for breakthrough technologies. I make one caveat on the border measure, and just to, make a distinction with what Peter just said on the border measure. If we would make the low carbon steel happening due to an extensive use of hydrogen or biochemicals or whatever, which may be happening, that steel is likely going to be much more expensive than normal steel. And only in that consideration, if we all would move out of the blast furnace technology and all move to the hydrogen-based steel production, for example, then there may be a case for a border measure to protect our industry, because a low carbon steel industry, a low carbon cement industry is what we are in need for. We have to make that happen. We have to crack that. And if that would turn out to be terribly expensive, then a border measure may do the trick and may help a lot. But before we are there, I would put a lot of emphasis on innovation instruments, on research and development, but gear it up much more to commercial companies that do really the investments. No PhDs, no fundamental research, but in the commercial companies who are setting up investment programs in this type of new technology. And when the spread is there, let's then consider how far we are, because there is an assumption, for example, that the cheap steel coming from China is having its origin in low carbon, in the carbon policy that is much weaker in China compared to here. That remains to be proven. There may be other sources of subsidies that are being given to the steel sector in China, much more important sources than carbon related, than climate related. There may be capital subsidies and other things, and it is the normal trade policy that has to address those distortions and not put that distortion that we feel is being there now only on the back of climate policy. That would be a street too far.
We added deliberately a question about a carbon border adjustment scheme if it's WTO compatible. It seems as though it's mainly there in the Green Deal as a potential threat if we don't get greater international cooperation. But it's a crucial question. Can you have a border adjustment tax that is WTO compatible, or is it just a contradiction in terms?
No. Article 20 of the WTO treaty foresees exemptions for environmental production, but it is on a rational basis. You just not can slam a kind of tax on one or the other product just like that. You have to prove that it is, in this case, carbon related, and that is where the whole thing becomes very complicated, because let's not dream, the current investments in steel in China are in state-of-the-art technology. It's no longer the old technology that they used to have 20 years ago. They are removing, as fast as we are removing, the old inefficient equipment and put in the latest technological equipment, also in a sector like steel or chemicals or cement.
Okay, good. Peter, briefly, if you don't mind.
On innovation, I want to come back to that. I mean, one of the striking things about the emissions trading system is that it generates a lot of revenues for governments, and they can direct them towards research and innovation. And indeed, the EU, a little bit of the auctioning revenue is reserved for the EU, and that's put in what we call the Innovation Fund, and that is specifically designed now to facilitate industrial innovation. It can't do it enough or alone, but this is the use of revenues. I think it's so important. It can address the just transition dimension. It can address the competitiveness and innovation dimensions as well. And we mustn't forget that, because the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, as it was in the very, very first years where everything was allocated for free, those days are gone. And we're generating now significant amounts of money. And I think those have to be carefully and sensibly spent.
All right. There was a whole other discussion we didn't have about financing, about the MFF, about the Just Transition Mechanism, the Just Transition Fund, whether it's enough, but let's save that for another day. We're 2 minutes from the end, so I'd like to quickly wrap up. I'd like to thank our two speakers today. I'd like to thank Joanna for doing such a great job, and obviously all of the people that have joined us online. And we have a little sweetie for you, which is the offer of a free copy of Peter and Jos's book, which you can find in the offers section. So I would encourage you to click on that and place your orders while the event is still going on.
But it is free. Please tell everyone it's free, and we don't get any royalties out of this.
No, we don't.
No more free allowances, only free books on the ETS.
Exactly.
And just to remind you that we will be having the next in the Climate Talk series on Tuesday with Kai Luca from ZF. It'll be the first time we really have the voice of industry to talk about how they see it, how the coronavirus is affecting their business, and what they want the EU institutions to do going forward. So thank you very much to everyone again, and hopefully you'll join us on Tuesday next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.